Welcome to The Details with Adam Froer and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and current topics happening in the world. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come examine the details with us. So, Cecil, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about a topic that has come up, I think, quite recently for both of us. Many times parents come to therapy and oftentimes they choose not to come, but they send their children and they say, in essence, fix my child or help my child behave differently or better or those kinds of things. And so we want to spend a little bit of time talking about how to parent. And I'm going to say, I guess, in a way of how to infuse solution-focused principles into your parenting. And I guess I should take one step back and talk a little bit about why are we having this kind of conversation. Typically, we talk about like a current event or what's happening in the world or those kinds of things. And so this might seem a little bit out of context, but I think I want to put it into context by saying how parents are expected to parent has changed over time. How children expect to engage with their parents has changed over time. And we're sitting in a moment in time where we're having conversations around, is corporal punishment acceptable or not? What's the psychological impact of corporal punishment, but also other things, right? What's the psychological impact of not allowing your child to have a cell phone or to access certain social media platforms? Or so what it means to be a parent and how parents and children are expected to interact with each other has changed over time. And I guess one of the ways that I would say that is that the independence and the autonomy of the child is highly valued now, much more than it was before. And so I think with this generational shift, it's hard for parents in this particular moment to look at their parents as examples to say, how did they parent? What did they do? How did they teach me? And then can I replicate that with my own children? Because technology has changed significantly, but also laws have changed significantly. What we deem as appropriate for children to do independently has changed over time. So we're sitting in this time period where I think oftentimes many parents will come to us and say, how do I do this parenting thing? Because what I am expected to do is very different than what my parents were expected to do. And I don't know how to be a parent.
Yeah, I think that's a really accurate description of these changes that our society's kind of seen when it comes to children and parenting. I am very much not a parent, but like you're saying, I have seen several adolescents, kids, teens, and even, the more recent invention of the adult child that seems to linger around in their parents' world longer than they used to. And I think I've become pretty familiar with that indecisiveness that can come with parents trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. And in some aspects, I think it's a good thing. It's a heightened awareness that your parenting, your behaviors, your choices can have consequences, whether good or bad ones. But I think it leads to being kind of struck with, I don't know what the right thing to do is. And always this lingering sense of there is a right answer. I got to do the right thing to be a good parent. And so I think, yeah, you're right. We are at a peculiar time where it seems like everything's kind of at this crux of how to give just enough independence so that they're not eternally dependent, but also how to be a parent of structure, someone who provides the security, the safety, the structure that children they don't have the nuanced foresight to give themselves or to plan out and to assume for themselves from a non-parent to a parent. It sounds really tough.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, I am a parent. I have 3 children, and it's interesting because I also find myself at this interesting moment in time. My oldest daughter recently, a couple weeks ago, turned 18 years old, right? So now I'm being called on to parent a seeming adult, although it's hard for me to imagine her as an adult. But I also have like this middle teenager, right, who's 14 years old. And then I have this kind of late childhood 11-year-olds. So kind of span these different moments in time. But I think in each of these instances, they either just made transitions, right, from elementary school to middle school, or from middle school to high school, or are preparing to make a transition from high school, then hopefully to university, right? And so I think that oftentimes when we encounter families, we oftentimes encounter them at these moments of transition, whether it's like in my family, school changes, or it's, a change in living situation, or it's a change in marital status where we were married and now we're divorced, or oftentimes where things become problematic, it's at points of transition. And I think sometimes we expect those points of transition around difficult things, right? If we're going to have to, when we lose a grandparent or even a pet, right? We lose a pet, we expect that our children are going to struggle or have a hard time. But I think one of the things that's important to understand off the bat is that sometimes those transitions can be good transitions. They can be, we have another baby in our family, so our family just got a little bit bigger, or maybe a parent got a new job, which, increases our resources. Maybe we get a new house. Even those things that are seemingly good can be moments of hardship for children. So I think that's also something just off the top to remember, is that children regularly are experiencing change, whether it's good change or bad change, and they don't know what to do because they've never encountered that change before.
Yeah, I think what you're describing speaks to the very systemic nature of how children present in their families. It seems like they're some of the most vulnerable members of the family to reflect the transitions and the changes that are happening, which is probably why I've seen so many teenagers coming in after COVID, and they're reflecting some very negative changes that their parents are worried about. They seem more depressed and more anxious and more whatever, less social. But you're absolutely right that it can also be good things, right? Like there's lots of studies about the correlations between like the number of books in the house increases the child's likelihood to go to college or something like that, or the time you spend with them reading or playing can have pro-social behavior in them. They'll be better at school with other peers. And so transitions, change, all these things can come naturally from them aging into different phases of their lives or things happening externally. But I think you can also introduce a sense of change into the system yourself. And I guess that's what therapy can be, is how do we get the system to rotate a bit to where we like where it's changing.
So if I ask you a question, if I say, for parents that are struggling, are there particular tips or are there suggestions about how to parent that maybe we don't read about in a typical book, or maybe we're not taught at school, right? Are there particular, because we're in this moment of transition in society, what are tips for modern day parents?
Yeah, this is something that I think, like I mentioned, I've seen quite a lot of teenagers and adolescents, and even college students who I still think are kind of in this weird phase of I'm a child, but I'm an adult. And this is the thing that I think allows them to be so successful at attaining the outcomes they do after therapy, and it allows our conversations to be so effective, is there's a very genuine trust in their capacity for knowing what's good for them. They might not always have the specifics of here's exactly how I can execute something perfectly, but I do think they're in touch with what's good for them. I think they have some understanding of knowing here's what I desire, and that thing will be a good thing for me. I think when people first hear that, there might be an assumption of risk of, well, they'd just eat candy all day, they would just do dangerous things, they would waste their lives away. But that's not been what I've seen. When I see that trust going into action in session with these teenagers, and you ask, things were to change for the better, what would you like that to be? What would you like that to look like? What would let you know things are moving in the right direction? They don't say, I do whatever I want all day. They don't say, I skip school. They don't say, I get to hang out with my friends and do drugs. They don't say the things that parents might be afraid that more agency would give them. They say things like, I want to kind of have a better idea of my future. I want to know that, I'll end up in a good place with a nice job, or I'll like what I'm doing. I'll like who's around me. They say things like, I want to be able to see my friends and feel like I have a comfortable social atmosphere, or I want to be able to feel like I found something I'm passionate about, whether that's, something at school, or that's a hobby, or a future career, or something like that. And so they really demonstrate that inside of them, there is this very real and powerful capacity for knowing something about what's good for them. And I think there's a temptation when you're parenting is to assume that that's not there, and that we have to give them what's good for them. We have to tell them what's good for them. And as a parent, of course, you have to do your job to provide security for them and structure for them, because they might not go to bed at the time that would be optimal for them. They might not eat the dinners that would be optimal for them. And so that's something that parents do have to provide. But there's a lot there that I think gets overlooked. And that'd be one of the first things that I would give to parents. I would say to parents, in trying to parent better, is starting to trust in that, starting to maybe even ask about that, starting to see them in that way. Even if you didn't directly ask about it, I think seeing them in that way could start to change how you parent them.
Yeah, I think you said some really, really important things in there. And I think one of the things you said in there is believe that they know what's good for them. I think there's a lot of research now about the way that adolescents view and interact with adults. And one of the things that is really apparent now, which I don't think was prevalent in earlier generations, is that adolescents especially expect to be told the truth. They just want transparency. They want the facts. They want to know what they're dealing with. They don't value interactions where they feel like they're being lied to, or that things are being sugar-coated or whatever. And I think that sometimes parents do those things. They won't tell the full truth, or they'll try to cover things up as a way to protect their children. And I think adolescents, because of social media, they are so used to just seeing reality in real time. I think oftentimes as adults, we think about social media as like the sugar-coated reality or the picture-perfect reality, but kids don't use social media in that way. They are so used to just taking selfies at all times, right? Snapchat oftentimes is whole conversations through pictures of myself. And that can be first thing in the morning. That can be, they're so used to just seeing each other in their natural state that they really value honesty and transparency. There's even a new platform that's called Be Real.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be countering that picture perfect view, right? It's like you have this moment in time to take your picture, to show people what you're doing and make it real. And if people post late, they get criticized because it's like, oh, you were just trying to make it perfect. So there's this real value in transparency and honesty. And so that's one of the things that I think is connected to that idea of they know what's good for them. They know what they value. They want honesty and transparency from you. And so I think that's the thing that I would say, even from very young children, starting early to just be honest and sit down and say, okay, we're having a hard month. Maybe money isn't it is tight this month. How do we as a family want to manage that? What's different, right? So involving children in decision-making processes, being honest with what our family situations are. And that grows as their capacity to manage and cope with truth grows. We give them more and more truth and the option to engage with that in whatever way they think is right and necessary. I think that's something really different. I think that it used to be that parents just knew what was right, knew what was wrong, told their children, you behave this way or else. And I think we see children really rebel from that very authoritative, I know what's right and you don't perspective and standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what other option do you have? Is either you're suppressed by the authoritative parenting that comes down on top of them, or you try to rebel your way around it. And maybe some kids have the personality to where they'll just deal with it and go along with it. But I think you can very well assume that lots of kids will not. They will find a way around that. Like you said, they will distrust you if you're not being honest and open with them. And they'll start to try to figure things out on their own, or they will just lie back to you so that they don't have to deal with that authoritarian kind of parenting style.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that we need to keep in mind as parents is that for a long time, parents were the source of truth, right? I could go look in the encyclopedia if I wanted to, but in essence, I had to go to my parents, or I had to go to a teacher, I had to go to an adult and say, what is this? What does this mean? Or whatever. And I just trusted what they told me. We now live in an era where truth or versions of the truth are available anywhere. I can get it on my phone. I can get it on any computer. I can go to my friend's house. So I no longer need to take my parents at face value. I can Google, in essence, did my parents tell me the truth? And I can get a whole bunch of information. So again, we have to change the way that we parent to be transparent and to engage in conversation and to say, look at all of this information that's available. How do you want to engage with this information? How do you want to behave? And so I think one of the conversations that we need to start having with our children is, there's lots of possible avenues for you to get this. What's the right way for you? It's about engaging in conversations around decision-making instead of just delivering, this is what you're going to do.
Yeah. And connected to that, I think that leads me to something else that I was thinking that is definitely something very important to keep in mind in parenting these days. But connected to that, you can't avoid difficult things if you're trying to be honest and open with children, especially if they're going to have access to that information or some version of that information some other way. And with the way that algorithms work and the way that, social media is just so open and everyone is there and information is everywhere, they might even not even be looking for whatever topics or informations or hard conversations that might come up. And so if you don't be direct and be open and honest and try to have them in on this decision-making process about how to understand and find this information, they could very well just fall into something. It might be faulty, it might be wrong, it might be dangerous, it might not be what is actually a really conducive way to look at that information. And so, like I said, I think that's very much connected to this idea of it's not in anyone's best interest to be unaccepting of difficult things when it comes to parenting. I think from the time they're born, you should just have an understanding that there will be lots of hard conversations to be had. There will be lots of hard experiences for them, for the family, for you. And instead of avoiding them or lying to them about them or trying to suppress the struggle of those things, I think you should accept them and try to deal with them. There were some studies that were done about people once they were older, they were kind of in young adulthood, but it was about their childhood. And they asked people a series of questions about difficult things that could happen during childhood. And it was about like grief and loss, it was about sickness, it was about, you have money troubles. And so all of these were lots of questions relating to hard things that could have happened to children throughout their childhood. And it found that people who had fewer of those things, people who had close to none of these difficult things, were currently having a really, really hard time in life. They were very sensitive to discomfort. They're very sensitive to any distress that might come up. And so even if there was a minor concern, it bothered them quite a lot. It disturbed them quite a lot. And then people who were on the other extreme end of it, who had too many of those things, if you think of it like childhood adverse effects, they were a bit disenfranchised by that. And so that was a disadvantage, that their life had been so encumbered by these hard things. But there was people who were somewhere in the sweet spot in the middle, who had somewhat of a medium amount of difficult things, where they somehow struck the balance of, I had enough to know how to deal with difficult things, how to embrace them, how to accept them, but not so much that I was over encumbered by it, and not so little that I was unfamiliar with it or that it was hidden from me. And so those are the people who were happiest. Those are the people who were most resilient. Those are the people who felt like they were the most satisfied at the moment. They would be able to deal with life as it is. I think that just further goes to show that instead of running away from difficult things or problems or whatever that might come up in parenting, embracing them and actually doing that with the child, like you were saying, so that it feels like problems are embraceable and we can do them.
Yeah, you made me think of a couple of things. The first thing, that my wife and I received some advice really early on that kind of took me aback. But looking back, I think it was one of the best pieces of advice that we ever got. And it was, if you think it's time to have a difficult conversation or to engage with your child around something, you probably are 7 years too late. Obviously, some of the major things that come up are like sex and sexuality and those kinds of things. we tend to think, and they get exposed to it in school in a very formal way in like 5th grade, 6th grade. They're 11, they're 12, right? The reality is, because of social media, because of the internet, most children are exposed to sexual content by the age of 4 or 5. And so if we wait until they're 11 or 12, there are multiple times where they probably have encountered this content and don't know how to engage with it. And so we were told, have the conversations much earlier than you think that you need to. And so with each of our children, we had very explicit conversations around 8 years old. And at least 2 of our 3 children said to us during those conversations, I've already heard that. I already know that. And so where we thought we were early, they had already heard or encouraged that. And so I think that's, a message of, we need not only to be willing to have hard conversations or engage with hard topics or embrace that difficulty, like you're saying, but we might need to engage with it earlier than we think we do.
Yeah.
And so that's the second thing that I would say is, in some sense, we need to cultivate a culture of conversation. And one of the things that my wife and I have tried to do is we call it a late night. So let's say my oldest daughter, her birthday is on the 7th of the month. Well, the 7th of each month, we have a late night with her. And there's 3 components to this late night. We play a game, we do something, interactive, social. We eat something delicious. Usually it contains sugar. And then the third component is the component where I think it's really meaningful, which is they get to ask us any 3 questions that they want, and we get to ask them any 3 questions that we want. And it starts out as they're very young that they ask really ridiculous questions like, what's your favorite animal? Right? But it gives them the autonomy to feel like they can question us, they can ask us, and we'll engage with them and we'll answer their questions. But it builds a culture of, we're going to ask you questions. We're going to inquire about what you think. We're going to value what you think. And obviously over time, as we have 12 of these late nights every year, over time, those late nights, the content of those late nights changes. It's, have you heard about this? Or do you know about this? Or what do you think about this? And sometimes it's still lighthearted, right? And we're like, hey, who are you interested in? And most of the time they say, I'm not interested in anyone. So I'm not under the illusion that we're going to get all of the information. But what it does do is it allows us to have conversations. I remember when my oldest daughter was 11. We discovered that she was receiving text messages from one friend about another friend who was self-harming and who self-harmed to the point where her life was in danger, that she bled quite significantly, and her parents discovered that she was in danger. So during one of these late nights, we got to have the conversation of, what was it like for you to hear that about your friend? And again, I wasn't anticipating having that conversation with an 11-year-old. But it gave her an opportunity to say, well, why would she do that? What was that? And then we got to engage with, well, sometimes people feel a lot and they need some way to get it out, or they need some way to manage or cope with it because it feels like it's too much. Have you ever felt like that? Right. And so it creates an environment where conversation is an acceptable thing. It creates an environment where we talk about the realities of what you're encountering. And again, if we start that usually around the time they start school, so they're in kindergarten. So by the time they're teenagers, they're very used to, usually they come prepared and they're like, I have a question about this. I want to know about this. What do you know? And we say all the time, you ask us anything you want to ask, because I would so much rather you hear it from me than your crazy friends who probably don't know, or going online where who knows if the content that you're accessing is accurate. So, and if I don't know, we can go online together and we can look and be like, is that real? Why would you ever do that? Right. So at least that way, then we can engage with the content in a meaningful way. And so I think those are 2 things that you kind of spurred my memory about, is you need to be transparent and you need to have conversation. You need to build a culture of conversation earlier than you think you need to.
No, I think that's totally true. When I was growing up, which, the internet was around, but that wasn't the go-to. It was too much work to actually try to start up the computer and
dial in.
Yeah, find all your answers or whatever. So when I was little, the source of information on all of these things was either older siblings or your friends' older siblings. And I think that's just as bad or worse than the darkest parts of the internet. But you're right, because I think those conversations, it's very easy for them to be too late, especially if they're about topics that might be taboo or for some reason adults just assume isn't right for a kid to have an opinion or an experience of that thing yet. The truth of the matter is, like you said, it's these are very slippery things. They're getting into this well before we might think it's the right time, or well before, I think more accurately, parents feel comfortable having a conversation about sex or drugs or any of the things that might be something hard that they'll have to deal with.
Yeah. And I just think there's so many, we've really kind of honed in on like difficult topics and how to have a conversation. And I think perhaps don't have time now, but I think we should come back to behavior problems, right? I think there's a whole nother component. Maybe we can do that next time, is talk about what do you do if your child is behaving in a way you don't want them to behave in. And so I want to acknowledge, I know that our conversation is kind of angled in one particular way, but perhaps we just need to do like a parenting series.
Oh, you mean we couldn't solve parenting in 20 minutes?
So before we end, I just wanted to acknowledge that. But I think that creating a culture of conversation and really valuing what your child thinks and really trusting that they know what's good for them, those are hard things for parents to do, but I think they're really, really vital things for parents to do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution-focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution-focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution-focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution-focused brief therapy.